Senator Bragg.
Thanks very much, Acting Deputy President. Well, the Australian people are a very generous bunch of people, and we have overseen one of the largest migration programs that any country has seen since the Second World War. And we have been able to take in people from all across the globe. And that's been possible because whilst governments have run proper migration programs, they've also been prepared to protect the citizenry and to protect the Australian people, the existing Australian people, as part of that process. And so the confidence that the Australian people have in the migration program is a very important thing, because we have been a very successful and harmonious multicultural society, perhaps the most successful. And the confidence that the community has in the government of the day, that it is able to protect the Australian people, is critical to maintaining that confidence that we want to see, because we want to be a country which is open for business, and we want to be a country that is able to accept genuine refugees, as we have over the last 75 years in particular. And that is what is so disappointing about the way that this has been managed. And I've spent a lot of my contributions in this chamber talking about the economic mismanagement of this government. But this is another very disappointing failure, in that it is maladministration writ large, that you could know about something that was a possible risk to the community. For more than 6 months, the government was on notice that it was possible that the High Court would say that law is not valid, and therefore the people that have been held in detention will be released into the community, including people who have been convicted of very serious crimes. Now, maintaining confidence is one thing, but it is also important that we don't have a situation where there are loopholes in our successful border protection regime. And when I talk about border protection, I'm talking about a policy suite that sits alongside a successful migration program. These two things are interlinked. And there is a risk, a very large risk here, setting aside the risk about community confidence and community safety, that there could be a situation where a very large loophole could be opened up, where stateless people could be artificially constructed and thereby use this loophole, which has been opened up by the law being struck down, which the government knew was a risk. The government knew about this for 6 months. And that is now something that we have to consider and to fix, because we cannot have holes in our border protection regime. If there are holes, they will be exploited by criminals, people smugglers and the like. And if there is a way for people to destroy their identification and to become stateless in some form, that cannot be a backdoor into our migration program, because, Deputy President, Acting Deputy President, Australia is a great country, it is a harmonious country, and there are millions of people around the world that would like to come here. But that needs to be done on a legal and orderly basis. And one thing that everyone in the coalition agrees with is that we need to manage our borders in accordance with our rules and our values, and we do that in conjunction with a generous humanitarian program and other migration programs. Now, this was not an unforeseeable risk. 6 months ago, the government was put on notice that this was going to be a potential problem, and last week the High Court has found that the law was to be struck down. In the last week, we've now seen a process where 83 or 84 people have been released into the community. Murderers, rapists, other criminals released into the community, and that number could swell to 340. You could see 340 criminals released onto Australia's streets with no measure and this is a key point, there is no measure that can be deployed to detain these people. There's no lawful way of detaining one of these people because of the High Court's judgment. And right now, as it stands, we have a lawless position. It is a lawless position. And the 83 or 84 people, could be 340, can effectively do what they like. And there is no capacity to re-detain these people. And that is an unacceptable risk in a free society which believes in the rule of law, which believes in orderly migration, and the Australian people would expect better from their government. The Australian people would expect that, okay, the government has been put on notice 6 months ago that there was a problem with the law which may lead to the release of murderers and rapists. And the Australian people, as I say, are reasonable people, and they would have expected that the government would have a contingency plan in case the High Court did strike down the law, and then in that afternoon or the next day, the minister in the government will walk into the parliament, table the legislation which fixes the loophole and protects these people, protects the people, the citizens of Australia, and gives the law enforcement authorities some capacity to detain people and to protect the community. And at the moment, unfortunately, our law enforcement agencies are not equipped with any legal power or jurisdiction to do anything in relation to these group of people. Now, the government have introduced, belatedly, a bill into this parliament which puts very rudimentary, very basic obligations which will apply to these people. One of them is an obligation to disclose if there has been a club membership taken out. Now, that is not a particularly onerous duty that is to be imposed onto these people, and there are a bunch of other very simple obligations. At just 17 pages, I regret to report to the Senate that, as the other coalition members and senators have stated today, that the bill does need to be amended to ensure that it meets the standard that the community would expect. And the community would expect that there would be mandatory monitoring of criminals, that there would be mandatory monitoring of murderers and rapists that are in our community now, that have been released through a quirk in the law. And it is hugely regrettable that the government have gone soft here in terms of the visa conditions that are to apply under the government's legislation. Now, a 17-page bill is not a very large bill in the scheme of the work that this parliament does. And it is very troubling that this bill has taken almost a week to develop. And as I say, it is a very weak bill. And that's why our amendments to impose mandatory sentences for serious breaches of visa conditions and to put in place mandatory electronic surveillance and monitoring and curfews is an entirely reasonable proposition, because that is what the community expects. The community would not expect that there would be hardened criminals walking around the streets just because they have been subject to a quirk or a loophole in the legal system. There's no situation in this country where an Australian citizen would expect to be sitting on a train next to a murderer or a rapist just because there was a loophole. They would expect that a murderer or a rapist would be serving a custodial sentence. That is the standard that the Australian people expect. And as I say, this puts, in my opinion, the confidence that the Australian people may have in the long-running and very successful migration program. Because if the Australian people feel that the government is incapable of protecting their interests and their families, then there will be a loss of confidence in the system. Now, the other speakers have already catalogued They're revolting cases that have been applied here in terms of some of the crimes that have been committed. And I won't seek to detain this any longer, but it is hugely regrettable that it has taken the government so long to do this. And I have to say, it reminds me a lot of the last time that Labor was the government of Australia. They were very, very poor when it came to economic management, and in relation to the management of the migration system, I have to say that the last Labor government lost the confidence of the Australian people on issues like this. So this is a key test for the government. Will they be prepared to entertain some of the very reasonable suggestions that we are suggesting in terms of the amendments? Because it's just not good enough that Australian people should be exposed to murderers and rapists in their day-to-day life. The bill should be strengthened, and I urge the Senate to take this course of action.